Amid all the squabbling today in Parliament, the two sides are saying eye to eye on one issue you might not have heard a lot about. The Magnitsky Act is something that's been passed in the US initially and is spreading around the world. It's about governments being able to sanction people over things such as human rights violations, and that can include government actors as well, people from other governments. One of the people that's written this op-ed is Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching, who joins me now here in the studio. Thanks for your time.
Hi, Tom.
So this particular push is off the back of the way it's being framed, the treatment of Uyghurs in China. So in this situation, who could the Act target?
Well, it would target government actors. So I should probably explain why it first came into existence. And that was Sergei Magnitsky, who was a tax advisor to an Anglo-American businessman who had Bill Browder, who had businesses in Russia. And he found that the Russian state had actually embezzled about $230 million from Bill Browder's companies. Sergei Magnitsky was then arrested by Russian police and died. He was tortured in jail.
So alerted them to what was a crime.
Yes.
As a result,
and
arrested, tortured,
yes,
died in jail.
Died in a Russian jail.
And to sanction the people responsible,
that's right,
this act got introduced.
Yes, and Bill Browder, with whom I had a phone hook up this morning actually, he was so outraged by this egregious action that was essentially state-sanctioned that he went to the US Congress and started to advocate for Magnitsky-style legislation. Now, obviously, we, like the US, have other types of legislation that can deal with situations like this, like the Autonomous Sanctions Act. Perhaps you could use Section 501 of the Immigration Act, which is sort of a character test section.
To stop someone coming to Australia,
yes, but this is this is a scalpel rather than, so it allows you to directly target.
So explain how this could work in this case to do with the treatment of Uyghurs. Can you give us an example?
So, for example, if there were found, so say you're an official in Xinjiang and you had been found to have committed gross acts of human rights violations, you could be, and you want to come to Australia, you could be under the Magnitsky-style legislation, you could be denied a visa, denied entry into this country. But we also know that there are many people around the world who also commit gross acts of corruption, so they embezzle money, and you think of some of the Russian oligarchs who have purchased, half of Chelsea in London, for example, and they could be targeted because they have committed such large acts, such egregious acts. They could be targeted, and in fact their property can also be seized.
If it's in Australia, for example.
Yes, and what I think is really important about this legislation is, obviously, if you're in such a country where you can obviously, large-scale acts of corruption, $230 million, it doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen in countries with rule of law.
And the more countries that get that up, you
create
this sort of...
But the people who are committing those kinds of acts are often using our own country, our own rule of law, our really fantastic, property rights.
They want real safe havens, what they're doing.
Absolutely.
In stable countries where they can go one day. So, okay, but talk us through the situation with the Uyghurs at the moment. Who could it apply to? Are we talking about someone who's in charge at a camp? Because they might say they're following orders. We're talking about the local...
But we know that we don't accept that. So the Nuremberg defence we don't accept that, because we think that, in fact, that if you, as some of those SS guards who tried to say that, they tried to use a defence like that. It's
still not a legal act.
And that's right, it's an illegal... So you know yourself as a human being.
Is there anyone you can identify right now that if this act was passed and you can say, this person, we know what this has happened to do with the Uyghurs, and they would be blocked from coming to Australia?
There are some Uyghurs actually in Parliament House right at the moment who are here to advocate for what is happening in Xinjiang, for the release of those people there. And I think, and they are very interested in having Magnitsky-style legislation here. So where it could apply is someone who is, perhaps an organiser, someone who is, who's been involved in that regime, who has done acts that we would consider, the international community would consider to be human rights violations.
And so what level of proof would you need to establish there? If you have three people saying, this is the person's name, this is what they did, how do we prove that from here?
Oh, and there are, other countries with this legislation, there are very strict, very stringent checks and balances, because obviously you're saying, no, you can't come here. You're also saying to some people, where it applies, the property you have purchased here, we are going to seize that property. You will not have the benefit of it.
That's a proceed of crime, basically.
Yes.
But how do you establish that? Because if we said to China, this person's done this, I'm sure they'd say, nothing to see here, because they deny there's any persecution of the Uyghurs.
So we would take, so in the United States, what they have done is they've taken evidence from people, they've used other evidence they've been able to adduce from their security agency. So we would be looking to do something
of that sort. So does it go through a court of some sort?
It goes through, in the United States, it goes through the different departments. So the State Department, for example, so our DFAT.
Right.
So they would be involved, they would be heavily involved.
So there's a panel of decision makers in DFAT, for example.
Yeah, but they would be taking evidence from our agency. I mean, obviously you need the checks and balances, because you don't want to have the system misused. No. But we know in some cases, as Bill Browder did when he started to advocate on behalf of Sergei Magnitsky, he knew that the Russians had been involved, the Russian state had been involved, and certain Russian police officers had been involved.
Right.
And they
were able to establish a level.
Yes.
The other thing with the situation with the Uyghurs, from the leaks we've got, is this is a strategy that goes all the way to the top. So why would Xi Jinping be able to come to Australia if he's approving of...
And this is why you have a very stringent check and balance system in the legislation.
And what does that mean? Are leaders untouchable?
No, I think we all know that. Well, in our system, of course, we don't consider anyone untouchable by the law.
So could this mean that Xi Jinping's blocked from coming to Australia?
Tom, you're asking me that. You would obviously, that is why you have those checks and balances.
But what does that mean?
And I'll give you an example. There are generals in Cambodia, and there's an article written today about this. But there are generals in Cambodia, for example, whose family members own property in Melbourne. They have been involved in human rights violations. This Act and they are trying to really to bully the diaspora, the Cambodian diaspora in Melbourne, and there was an ABC show on this recently.
What if there's a document that says that Xi Jinping personally, signed off on the strategy of persecuting the Uyghurs? Could he be blocked from coming to Australia?
And that might not be a decision for. That might be a decision that an executive government might take at that point. I mean, that's a much more. So that's an issue that would have to be sorted out, I think.
So the executive, it wouldn't just be up to this panel in DFAT. The executive could go, no, you're not touching them. This is going to create
we will have an inquiry. The Joint Standing Committee for Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, of which I'm a member, will be having an inquiry that will end around March the 26th next year. So we will be seeking evidence from people. Bill Browder has indicated he will come to give evidence. We would certainly reach out to people like Jeffrey Robertson, who has been very, very strong on the need for Magnitsky legislation.
All right.
So he's a well-known human rights campaigner, obviously.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on Medivac as well. We're in this situation with the existing legislation. The government just says a blanket ban on anyone that arrived in Australia by boat after 2013 on ever coming to Australia. That is what Kevin Rudd said in his policy in terms of resettled. Should Labor be open to this if it's a deal breaker for the government?
I mean, I think it's very hard for us to comment, given the government has done a deal which we don't know any of the detail of it.
We have a pretty good idea.
With Jackie Lambie. Yeah, but we don't know what it is.
There's a reassurance they're pursuing New Zealand.
She has said national security as a ground. I think the question the government has to answer is, are they using national security as a bargaining chip in all of this? And that would not be ideal.
Well, we'll continue to ask that question, but what should Labor do on the lifetime visa ban?
Well, I think that we should wait to see what the government's proposing. They're the government of the day.
We know what's existing, but we know the existing legislation.
Well, is that what they're putting up? It seems unclear from Scott Morrison's comments, I think, today at the press conference he gave.
Labor agreed to
where he just said, well, there's too many hypotheticals in the question. I can't possibly answer that.
Why? To press him.
Why? Because they actually don't know what they want to do.
Well, we know their existing legislation, and if you support that, then it goes through.
Well, we'll see. I think we should wait to see what they're going to propose, and also what the deal that they have done with Jackie, because of course they will continue to need her vote in the Senate to get it through the Senate.